going to kick off with Dr. Judy Matthews, who's here with me at Queensland University of Technology, and she's going to talk about policy and design-led innovation. And then she's going to be followed by Agnes Quick. It's a real delight to have her to share her expertise as the former design ambassador of Singapore. And I don't really want to hang around, like listen to me talking, apart from the fact that I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we're meeting today. So for me, that's the Turrbal and Yagara people here in central Brisbane. I want to respect and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and particularly just express, my awareness and appreciation of their knowledges. So with no further ado, Judy, I'm going to hand over to you if you want to start sharing your screen.
Yes. Okay, and I'll also say welcome to the Asia Pacific region. It's a real pleasure to see you. Hello, Willie. I haven't seen you for at least 2 years since New York. And I did log on before to make sure that I could get on. I saw you and I even saw Richard. So very nice.
So that's the wonderful. You go, sorry, go, Judy.
It's very nice. In fact, I couldn't get to the conference last year, so this is all about me. So it's very nice to actually join you this year. And really, in some ways, I guess we've moved on, but that's great. So just looking forward to sharing what we're doing here. And here we go.
While Judy's sharing her screen, I'll just remind everybody that she'll do a presentation for about 20 minutes, followed by Agnes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So pop any of your questions in the chat. Back to you, Judy.
Thanks, Yvonne. So welcome to the Asia Pacific region. I know this is many of you have visited here before, and we would always love to make you welcome whenever you'd like to come. Today, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on, I guess, quite a complex topic. The intersection of design-led innovation, but also how it has been applied to policy. And to start this, of course, we have to look at the Australian context. Now, Australia, I realise, may be different to other parts of the world, not surprisingly, in that we have different layers of government. So the agenda we're going to talk about is certainly the Australian context. We're going to briefly go through innovation, design-led innovation, and then, of course, digital design innovation. Talk a little bit about the historical developments, some of the early ones in relation to the Australian Tax Office and really where that's gone to. Then I'm going to talk about developing capabilities, which is really, I guess, the role of QUT and multiple roles within QUT. And then I'm going to go back to the National Data and Digital Nation, which is, I guess, where we're heading to, and then try to summarise in terms of where we've come and what's the present, and then, of course, where are we going, and maybe how can we as a global community somehow both share what we're doing, but also build some bridges in terms of what are some desirable futures. So I know the generic question that we're looking at is really how can we make public administration more digital, more human-centred, and of course, more innovative. Now, that's a very sketchy picture of Australia. And the reason I put it there is that I really want you to see the different levels. So in Australia, we have 3 levels of government. We have the national government, and in fact, the capital of Australia is Canberra, which is in its own Australian capital territories. So there's a layer of policy there. Then each of the states and territories, so we have 6 states and 2 territories, have their own levels of government and policy. And then, of course, going down even further, we have local government or councils who also develop their own policy around different challenges. So this is the sort of context that we're looking at. So I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot about what's happening at those different levels, briefly look at the themes, and then take it further. So I guess I'm going to start with maybe some of the knowledge that you already have about Australia. So there are some well-known studies in Australia, and many of you may be familiar with the Australian Tax Office study that John Boddy did. It was published in Design Issues, and I know many of us read Design Issues to actually see what the major approaches are, what's happening, and where that's going. So John Boddy was in fact a designer who went to work in the Australian Tax Office. Why? Because there'd be some changes made, and I really wanted to make them more human-centred. He wrote up that research in 2008, but in fact, it started in the year 2000. What did he do? He actually organised a series of conferences to bring new ideas into the Australian Tax Office. And I guess in some ways, we know that international scholars, of course, bring a lot of credibility. And so the first person he brought was, of course, Professor Richard Buchanan, who talks about his different layers of design. And really, while there are, we know, 4 layers of design, really the ones that Richard and John Body were looking at were really to do with the user-centered design, but also systems design. So where is John Body now? Well, John, after many years of work within the tax office, in fact, other people did PhDs on the work that he did in the tax office. In fact, he moved on from there to develop a consultancy called ThinkPlace, which is still very much based in Canberra, but now is an international company, which hires designers to work in multiple areas, of course, certain in practice and operations, but also to help governments develop policy. One of the strengths for us is one of our graduates from our Masters in Design-Led Innovation is actually working at ThinkPlace. He's not looking at the national policy, he's actually working in the international scene. But he was certainly telling me a day or so ago that still about 90% of the work that ThinkPlace are doing in the public sector is really based in Canberra, even though they have branches all over the world, Sydney, Washington, Kenya, Nairobi, many places. Still very much is that focus on public sector innovation, bringing human-centered design to the public sector. So many of you, of course, are very familiar with Christian Basson's work. And of course, one of his case studies was really the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. He looked at that again in his more recent work, where he went back to see what was happening with that case study. Another one you may be familiar with is, in fact, Jean Liedtke's work. Professor Jean Liedtke, until we had COVID and all those interruptions, would come very often to Australia. And we've welcomed her here at QUT to work with our MBA and executive MBA students. So she did a very interesting case study about looking at not just practice, but also policies within a health setting, within the Monash Medical Centre. So why have I looked here? I guess what I'm saying, there's a history going back at least 20 years of international scholars coming to Australia to actually look at what's happening here, but also to bring insights, to bring their knowledge, to share, and also to encourage different processes. And I guess in some ways, I think Yvonne and I are hoping that this will continue and really go forward. This is something that we'd like to build on. The other sort of case studies that happen, of course, are initiatives that have come up from the bottom up. And so there are many initiatives in innovation. This is in the national level, in the public sector in Canberra. For example, there was a whole design-led innovation initiative called Designed. It was very much nurtured by a fellow called Alex Roberts, who really wound that up in 2013. He went off to the OECD, and in fact, I understand now he's actually back in Australia. But while there are large initiatives led by the public sector and by organisations, also there are initiatives coming up. So I really want you to think, how do we both know and encourage both of these processes? Most of those are actually at the national level, as distinct from the more local level, which we'll get to quite soon. And that was really more to refresh you. And the slides actually have links if you want to follow up and actually learn more. This is very much a superficial and fast look at what's happening. So why are we concerned about design-led innovation and how it actually leads to changes in policy? And what are we doing here at QUT about it? Well, I guess at QUT, we actually have multiple layers. We have an organisation called QUTX, which works with public sector agencies really to bring design-led innovation into the challenges that they're facing. And so that's very much a staff-based approach. Sometimes it's with the whole organisation, a whole department may actually come and say, look, we really want to work with you and learn more about design-led innovation. We also have the QUT Design School and the QUT Design Lab, of which, in fact, Yvonne is the director. And that's very much engaged in certainly research, education, and practice around a whole lot of areas. Certainly health, digital technologies, and of course, resilient communities. We also ran a QUT Masters in Research PhD in design-led innovation. And many of those graduates have gone on to work in both public sector, but also private sector organisations. And I'll tell you a bit more about some of those. I work in the business school as well as being an affiliate researcher in the design lab. And so we run, of course, MBA and executive MBA programs in Brisbane and Canberra. And there we really introduce design-led thinking and design-led innovation to our students, and they work on action research projects to introduce that in their agencies. Sometimes they come with that in mind, but usually if they don't come with it, they soon pick it up, and that's really some of the challenges they face. And we also, within the business school, have a chair of the digital economy who actually have employed some of our research master students from our design-led innovation programs, and they work directly with companies. They carry out these 2-week sprints where they do a lot of background research. They find out what the challenges are. They work directly with the company, usually embedded in the company, and very much a co-creation approach, both developing and testing some new solutions that are very much around the digital economy and very much towards what's happening in the digital space. So some examples of what they do, some of the processes they've looked at have been homelessness, small business, family support, organizational culture, personalization, which is one of their, I guess, the big ones that I'll talk about in a moment, economic development, government accountability in terms of debt raising processes, and of course, grants and assistance. So a recent one they looked at was how do they develop digital services for the government, not just to make services more efficient, which is really, I guess, where a lot of the digital processes have happened in the past, but very much to focus on a person-centered approach so that we're really looking at how do people feel when they're engaging with these processes? How can we ensure that they're consulted and engaged and involved in that co-creation process? Over time, this chair of the digital economy, and I guess I'm spending a bit of time on this because I think they're arguing that really digital is essential. And I guess this is where a lot of the effort has gone more recently. So they put out a report just recently looking at all the research they've carried out with their government departments. And I guess they've been probably working with at least 20 different government departments over the last probably 4 or 5 years. And this is how they're trying to understand what's happening there. So they say, well, initially it was very much a process of what was the challenge. It was very much about individual service delivery. It was about access to services, and often it was about quality. Over time, though, they found it was about growth, the scaling service delivery, often volume and variety, but very much looking at what was happening along the value chain. And then, of course, how do we bring in some equitability for all users, as well as the officers who are operating as well as serving. Then there was more the whole efficient service delivery, of course, that isn't surprising, but very much about a practicality approach. Then there was a whole, and part of this, of course, is the development of digital technologies and the sophistication, and in fact, the power that we can get with digital technologies. So very much now looking at the whole of government, very much in, I guess, that whole reform public policy approach. Once again, looking at connectivity, but now looking at the connection between the teams. But more recently, I guess they're saying it's now focusing on the whole of life processes. What are the life events that are challenging for our citizens, for our individuals, for families, and for communities? And very much looking at how do we ensure that what's delivered to these services is actually desirable? Because that human-centered approach really needs to come through. So I've put a link there to their report. It's actually really trying to say, where have we come from and where are we going? And how do we ensure that we have a human-centered approach? So that's very much a local Queensland process, as distinct from a national process. So taking a step back from that, and I guess moving back up now to the national area, a very recent approach has actually looked at what is happening at the national level. And part of the challenge is I've tried to give a bit of a picture about what we're looking at here, and I guess what Yvonne and I have a bit of direct engagement in, as well as really what's happening at the national scene, because really, probably in Australia, a lot of the leadership does come from the national area. We have lots of local initiatives here, and in a way, it's really how do we bring them together? So this is a very recent report, which is really saying what's happening digitally across Australia. I think I have a link to this as well down the S, so it's easy to follow this up. And so you can see in terms of the case studies that are being carried out, there are case studies carried out broadly by the Australian Data and Digital Council. There's also some specifically for the Commonwealth Government. Queensland, in fact, of course, which is my focus, actually has at least 40 case studies, and I'm not going to go into those in any detail. But I want you to look at some of the key themes. And so you can see, of course, policy and strategy is essential, but you can see the second one is still a very strong focus on the user experience. And I guess that's really trying to ensure that really is a human-centered approach to how we understand who our clients and customers are, but how do we actually build those processes into new policies that are developed? And you'll see there this focus on life event communities, life event priorities, life event journey mapping and national governance. And I guess I'm just wondering over time, given that from my end, this is very much the beginning of the Global Design Thinking Alliance Conference, I'm interested to see to what extent those themes emerge throughout the conference. How much other regions in the world have decided that these are some primary areas that really need to be researched. And I guess in some ways, for me, one of the measures is that we maintain this focus on user experiences, user perspectives, users engagement. Because I guess for me, while digital is really important, unless we involve the community, unless we make sure there is a voice for people across their life cycle, so they have some say in what's happening, really for me, it doesn't have a lot of cachet or a lot of value. So trying to summarize all that, I guess, so looking back, what I've tried to highlight is some of the case studies, and it's still very much a superficial level, if you like, in terms of what's happening at the national level. What are some examples that have emerged locally? And the whole Government 5.0 report that I gave you a little snapshot of actually contains many, many case studies. And probably if you have time, I can actually go into that in a bit of detail. So I want you to see there are some real peaks looking back in terms of what were the directions, what were the trajectories that have led us to today. Certainly today, there's quite a lot of energy and enthusiasm, but there's also some cautious optimism, because we know that while we have made some great inroads and some great steps forward, we can't assume that those paths will stay as they are. It's a very dynamic field. There are all sorts of political pressures, initiatives, challenges, and also sometimes pressures to wind back some of these initiatives. So I don't want you to assume for a moment that, you know, all is great and well, although some things are, but how do we ensure that these things stay and go forward? So I guess I'm trying to think, what's the process that's happening here? So certainly there are some peaks and some really good examples. We can't assume the static picture. So what are the enablers? What are some of the processes that maybe have made this happen? What are some of the contributing factors, if you like, that maybe we need to ensure we capture, ensure we understand, and ensure that we can go forward with some of these? And so from my analysis, it really seems this linkage with international design scholars seems to be a really strong theme. And I guess in some ways, that's something I'm hoping that we continue with, and we can actually build some bridges to what's happening in other parts of the Global Alliance. And a part of this whole linkages isn't just that people come here and they sort of tell us what they do. It's a stimulating engagement in terms of both the challenging, the provocations, but also those really valuable conversations in terms of what's the purpose here? What were you trying to achieve? How did you go about that? What worked and what didn't? Which involves both planning, but also reflecting. And I think that's really where we learn. While we can go forward with certain principles, we really need to reflect on what's worked and what hasn't. How do we go from there? How do we actually continue this knowledge sharing? And of course, we'll always do knowledge sharing through reports, conference papers, and of course, research articles. But there may well, given the technologies we have today, be better more efficient, but also sometimes more effective ways of sharing our knowledge. And I guess one of the challenges I have, and maybe it might be about starting locally in the Asia Pacific region as much as reaching out to the other regions, how can we ensure that going forward we have these international collaborations in research training, in educating our local and international students, but also in our practice and policy processes so that we can learn from what's worked elsewhere and maybe go forward. So the challenge that I guess I've been thinking about and probably framing here is, how do we go forward? Where to from here? So I'm going to stop there. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Yvonne, I should have told you to stop me at some stage.
No, you're perfect, Judy.